and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be looking at how to critically analyze the text Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Now, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at basically the types of questions you'll be asked about this text. And in doing so, we're just going to go through some very quick methods of analyzing different parts of text, where to look for your answers, and to just generally go through different features of the text which you can then use in your responses. So it's essentially just a very quick guide of and sort of almost dot points and sticky notes about where you should be looking in the story to find your answers to questions on this text. Now, as it is a very complex text, it's one of the ones where you basically need to really break it down quite a lot. So we'll examine the aspects of the text that are important in constructing a response. And we're also going to be looking at examining where to look for these answers. So you don't have to go combing through the entire story back to front over and over again in order to find the answers you're looking for. Okay, now the best way to start this is basically to look for some key scenes. And what I've done here is I've picked out a couple of key scenes for you, which you can choose to use. There are obviously other very important scenes in the story. I've just picked my top 5 here, which you can then use in relation to your responses. Now, the first one is from Volume 1, Chapter 5, and it's roughly about page 59, where the first moment that Dr. Frankenstein, wakes his monster. So we see a very sort of vivid description. We see obviously the description of the beast, but also the description of Victor's reaction to it, and essentially the sense of horror that he feels when he first lays eyes on this, and also the sorts of things that he's still thinking about when he seeks to create it. Volume 1, Chapter 8, this is I think it's the last chapter of the first volume, roughly about page 91, which is the trial of Justine, who's been accused. She's the nanny of William, who's been accused of his murder, when in fact it was the beast who was responsible. And particularly it's important, that chapter, because of Victor's reaction. The fact that he knows that she's innocent, that he knows that it's his beast which has caused it, and yet he can't own up for it. And as much as he wants to sort of scream out he's accountable, he knows that A, no one would believe him, and B, that he would basically be around our town forever, and that would help no one. So he sort of has to stay quiet, even to the point where she is hanged for her crimes that she didn't commit. Volume 2, Chapter 2, roughly about 113. This is where Frankenstein confronts the beast for the first time, and we start to have the beast speaking. So we've got another narrator. We've got the beast telling about his experience, his experience with the Lacey's, his experience with the woman who is drowning, all the other things that has basically led him to believe that he is doomed to be alone forever unless Victor creates his companion for him. Volume 3, Chapter 6, 243, which is basically Victor and Elizabeth's wedding, where we really see Victor's growing, and by this point, rather out of control paranoia, this threat from the beast. And in particular, it's a very emotional section of the story where really it sort of inspires a chase around the world for this beast that Victor goes on trying to hunt him down. And finally, page 273. Now, this is one of the epilogue letters. So after the story of Victor is finished, where we get the climax, which is essentially the part of the story where the beast holds onto the corpse of Frankenstein and bemoans what sort of person he was, and also doesn't forgive Victor for the things that he did. So it's a very key scene to the story, and it's one that sort of sums up everything in a very neat little package. So there are basically the top 5 of at least my key scenes. There are others in there which are also very, very important scenes, which you can also use depending on the kinds of responses you may be asked to do. But this is basically a very general guide to some very key scenes. And what you do here is essentially, as you're going through the text, you would focus on these sections, really pull them apart, take them apart bit by piece, really get into them, discuss the real key pieces of language, text, the themes, ideas, all the things that are conveyed. Now, the thing about this is also it basically takes sections from throughout the whole book, which is what you'd be trying to look for. So when you choose your key scenes, don't just choose on the first volume or the second volume. Try and spread them out so you have a sort of a cutaway through the entire story which you can refer to. All right, first thing we're going to look at is text and context, because this is quite an important aspect. And it's basically, it is written in an age of scientific discovery, and it's a time where we're moving away from the church. This is a story where we're sort of exploring science for the first time, where ethical questions were not really being asked in science because of the fact that science was often done before this particular period in secret. It was stuff of basements by intelligent people would lock themselves away and conduct scientific experiments away from the eyes of the church, who would immediately shut them down the moment they caught wind of it. So at this stage, they were just happy to be practicing science. They weren't asking ethical questions about things. So the sorts of questions that are being raised in this are sort of ones which we can now interpret particularly. It probably wasn't such an important consideration at the time, but it's one where we can sort of definitely ask ethical questions about what it means to not only impact on nature through the actions of science and the actions of humanity, but also to really develop this sort of this comprehensive sense of morality, what is right and wrong. And that's not something that hasn't really been covered at this particular time. It's the first science fiction text, also considered to be one of the first horror stories. So it's one which is very genre-breaking in the fact that it doesn't really follow the styles of those that came before, because it's not really anything that did come before it. And the fact that, as the first story, it uses elements of other trends at the time, it wasn't necessarily the absolute first horror story ever known to man. However, it uses elements of stories which have basically inspired Gothic fiction, and Gothic fiction had been around a little while before this, and all these other ideas which basically came out of this movement. And a time of social change. It was the Industrial Revolution, and particularly the time when this conversation was happening as well was at a particular dark point in history, where there was a volcano that had erupted in 1815 in Europe, which was basically creating a big black smoke cloud, which was basically leading to a very, very cold summer. So because of that, we had this sort of very bleak mood to sort of start things off, and which is often why a lot of the descriptions in the text are quite icy. And certainly snow is one of the predominant features, and particularly in this description of Geneva. I mean, Switzerland is a very cold place anyway, but it was even colder at this particular time because of the fact that this volcano had erupted. All right, language, where it's very descriptive. They're very long-winded sort of sentences, and there's also a very heavy focus on emotion and imagery. Now, these are both basically styles which are indicative of Romanticism, and that they're very descriptive, long-winded. There's a lot of imagery in there. It's essentially like this painting to my right here, which is essentially really looking at encompassing almost the whole picture of nature around them. So it gives details about everything that's in there. And the reason for that is it's sort of trying to link the human experience back into the world around them. And it does it by basically, in the way that we pick apart people to almost every small, minute detail, Romanticism picks apart nature to every small, minute detail and starts comparing all of those things, starts drawing lines between all the things which are inherent in nature and all the things that are inherent in humanity, and sort of uses them each as a metaphor for the other. So humans are a metaphor for nature, and nature is a metaphor for humans. It sort of goes back and forth that way. And so you do get a lot of emotional responses in imagery, and it's particularly because of the fact that we are looking at it through, I guess, our own eyes and sort of taking ownership of the world around us. It's quite figurative. It uses extended metaphor and analogy, so as I was mentioning before, there's sort of connection between the two, to discuss motifs of life and death. And particularly you can see through these descriptions of nature, we sort of almost see this world which is constantly living and dying. Just like we've got this the story where there is a lot of death, and there's also this question about what is life, particularly because of the fact that we've got life created from death, which is created from life. So we've got this sort of paradox that continues on. And certainly this idea, which becomes quite complex when you really just draw it out. And that's one of the reasons why this makes such an interesting text to read and quite a difficult text to study. There are long pieces of dialogue as well, and which follow basically long anecdotes. So we get a long piece of dialogue from the creature when he's describing his time away from Victor, when he's roaming the countryside trying to find people to belong with. There's a lot of description from Victor himself. The whole story seems to follow that idea of this anecdote, and particularly long sections are almost Frankenstein trying to justify himself and trying to explain that I'm not a madman, I'm not crazy, I'm not an idiot, yet I sort of am. So there's this sort of really anecdotal tone to it where it's trying to just tell his story as well. All right. Themes. Now, there are a lot of themes in here, but we'll just give you a couple of ideas to start with, and then as you go through, you can explore these as you go. So science and nature, obvious one. Identity, revenge is one that comes up. Humanity, so this idea of what really makes something human, and this idea of what other people do to this creature because of the fact that he looks so different. Obsession. So this obsession that Frankenstein has with just basically having companionship. It's a preoccupation. And it's through this preoccupation that he starts to get desperate. And through his desperation, we start to see a lot of things happening. Particularly the deaths of Victor's friends and family come because of this monster's obsession with just being loved. Tragedy. So this element of everything. There's very little happiness in this story. There is happiness, but there's very little of it, and it's sparingly used. And there's this sort of sense that nothing ends well for anyone. The sublime, so we get this contrast with this tragedy. There's this idea that life is still quite beautiful, despite of all this tragedy that's sort of described within the story. It sort of offsets that. So we've got this very bleak sort of tragic storyline, but yet we've got this story of the sublime, the really beautiful that goes with it. So there's this combination of those two things. Now, the writing style, which is also an important consideration. It's written in frames, so basically a narrator within a narrator. And through this sort of framing, we get a different sort of literary style. It's actually quite similar to a play structure. It's set in 3 volumes, so almost like 3 acts. And each volume has a setup and a climax. So between each act, we sort of have this setup where we sort of carry on to a new part of the story. And then we get this epic conclusion, which then leads into the next volume. So pretty much like a play would. So like a play would have intermissions between the two of them, this one just has volumes. And it's a very unique way of writing a story. It's probably quite unique to Shelley, and there are some others like that, but it sort of has a very different way of being composed, which is also gives you something to discuss in the way that you can actually talk about its composition. And the narrator within the narrator, combined with the fact that it's in 3 volumes, gives you quite a few points there immediately on composition. The writing combines aspects of romanticism and Gothic imagery, that there is basically contrast between light and dark. So we get this sensation throughout that there's this very beautiful element, but yet there's this also very dark element to the story, which sort of continues on throughout. So this is the sort of thing that continues, and there's sort of this constant balance. So again, through that composition, we can sort of see this light and dark being constantly bounced back and forth. And it's one of those things that in your analysis you can make a note of. Now, the thing with all of these aspects that I've covered is you need to pay very careful attention to why you are analysing the text. Now, you're analysing a text for a number of reasons. First of all, you're usually doing it to satisfy a criteria. and that is that it's a specific question that gets asked of you. Now the thing is, it's important to go through and develop your own critical analysis of these sections, and the reason for that is you can be asked a number of different questions on them, and by having an answer for every occasion, what you're doing is essentially you're enabling yourself to write better, higher quality responses. Now, as this is a very difficult text, this is one that will really test out your skills of interpretation. It's one that will force you to really look at ideas that will probably make you uncomfortable and certainly will make you feel a little bit uncertain, and that they're often given very little clarity. But the thing is that once you go through and have your own interpretation of them, and you can back them up with the text, and the text gives you lots of opportunities to support your ideas, then you've got something there that allows you to essentially compose a response which is quite solid, and can also play on all these various ideas that are in there. So it's not so much a matter of taking notes and just making sure you include the words romanticism and Gothic imagery. Yes, those are important ideas, but they're not necessarily important for you constructing a response if those sorts of things aren't covered. So make sure that when you do look at this text that you're just looking at interpreting the ideas that are relevant, making sure that you've got some aspects which cover what is being asked, and develop your own response in the way that you've got all of these elements in the way that you've got a cohesive argument which is structured, and that you've basically give you an airtight response. So that's basically it for critical analysis of Frankenstein. I hope you've enjoyed it, and certainly go back over the video again if you wish to take notes a second time around, or if you're already taking notes, then just to go over some of these ideas again, but also to really just have a look at some ideas which you can then look at exploring further. It does require you to do some work. It requires you to go through the text. It requires you to do some research. Online is a really good spot to start with, and looking at what sorts of ideas you like about the story, as in what sort of ideas you can use and you feel confident discussing if you're asked something about this text. But otherwise, that's about it for Frankenstein. Until next time, I'll see you later.